I want to wish everybody a good evening and welcome to another happy hour brought to you by NAAP. We are the National Association of Adoptees and Parents, where it is our mission to build unity in the adoption community and elevate our diverse voices by promoting dialogue, understanding, and healing through education, awareness, and connection. My name is Marcie Keithley. I am a board member and host for the evening, and along with Jennifer Falsing helping out in the Zoom room. I know we have some board members with us this evening. In addition to Jennifer, Dave Bull, Beth Sturry. Let's see if anybody else has joined us. Okay. All righty. At this, again, if you're already on mute, please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself to KelLee. Let him know what state or country that you're viewing from this evening and give him a shout out. I would appreciate that. And Jennifer, you want to go ahead and start our slides, please, before I do the introduction. Again, please raise your hand on the screen to be recognized, your virtual hand. You can post comments and questions in the chat bar. This is a public meeting with no guarantee that information or identity is confidential. Portions of the event are recorded and shared on our YouTube channel. If you are experiencing a serious mental health event or suicidal thoughts, please contact a licensed professional or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Great, thanks, Jennifer. At this time, I would like to introduce our spotlight guest for the evening, KelLee Parr, and I'd like to share just a little bit about KelLee with you. KelLee grew up on a farm in Northeast Kansas. He is a graduate from Kansas State University. After graduating with a degree in animal science, he spent 3 years in Guatemala working as an agricultural and literacy missionary. Upon returning home, he worked as a county extension agricultural and forage agent before going back to get a degree to teach. He taught 3rd grade for many years and was a professor of Washburn University. After retiring from teaching, he currently is vice president and product manager for an educational publisher, writing science curriculum for elementary students. He is the author of My Little Valentine, the story of a mother and daughter's lost love, Mansion on a Hill, the story of the Willows Maternity Sanitarium, and the Adoption Hub of America, and his newest book, More Voices of the Willows. So at this time, it gives me great honor to introduce KelLee to Happy Hour. Please join me.
Thank you. I really appreciate your inviting me to join you, and it's a lot of fun for me to be able to share my story, and very happy to answer any questions that you might have about my connection with adoption, with searches and reunions. And as we mentioned there a little bit earlier, I have had the pleasure to get Karen and how she has been involved with searches and people that I have gotten to know that were Willows babies as well. So I'm going to share first about how I got started and a little bit about my mother and who was adopted. I was a grandchild of a mother who was an unwed mother. So I'm going to start my screen. I'll share my PowerPoint with you. It says only hosts can share. There we go. Can you all see the screen now? So the title of my book is My Little Valentine. So this story that we're going to talk about today is about an adoption and search and reunion story. And it really is the story of 2 women who love the same child.
KelLee,
yes.
I interrupt. I don't see the screen. Does anybody else see it? See the PowerPoint?
No.
Okay, let's back up here. I can see my screen.
Did you hear that hit the share button?
Yeah, I had hit the share button. Let's see again. Try again.
There we go.
Okay.
You're good.
How about that?
There we go.
Okay. I want to get rid of my little thing up here at the top so I can actually see all of my screen. I'm still seeing all the pictures of everybody. Okay, can you still see it?
Yes.
Okay, so again, this is the title, My Little Valentine. I'm going to share with you about my search and the reunion story of my mother and my grandmother. So this is pictures of two women who love the same child. The woman on the left is Emma. She was born in 1889, and on the right is Leona, who was born in 1907. Emma was raised by her grandmother. Her mother was married to a man who was her stepfather, and he did not want my grandma Emma. And so she was raised by her grandma. So her whole life, she sort of had this longing of family that she missed out on. She ended up getting married March 1st, 1914 to Lynn Keller at Holton, Kansas. And he grew up with a large family and were farmers. And this is a picture of he and his twin sister, Lillian. And he truly was a very, very dignified and very intelligent man. And he was my grandfather. And they were farmers. And of course, they wanted to have children. Well, they went several years without being able to have any children. And I think my grandmother even had a few miscarriages. So they found out through newspaper ads that there was a place in Kansas City where you could go and you could adopt children. So this is an advertisement from the Willows Maternity Sanitarium that was in Kansas City, Missouri. And it says, "What a boy means to your family circle. Sunny for short and sunny for the brightness he brings. Many bright, attractive, healthy boy babies for adoption, ranging in age up to 12 months. Call or write for a booklet and information. The Willows, 2929 Main Street." Now, this was in Kansas City, Missouri. So my grandmother wrote, and they were able to adopt a boy in 1920. This is actually where the Willows was located, and this was the original building. They started the Willows in 1905, but the building that they were in when my grandmother and grandfather went and picked up my uncle was in 1908. And it was a big mansion that overlooked downtown Kansas City. It was a building that they kept adding on to, and this is what it started to look like in the 1920s. And it was a big, gigantic facility. And this is a picture of my grandparents going to pick up their firstborn son, or that was Philip. He was born October 9th, 1919, and he was adopted in March of 1920. And as often happens, when they adopted, my grandma got pregnant immediately and had a baby boy. And so they had two boys, and they went several years without having any more children. And so my grandmother and my grandfather decided they wanted to adopt a little girl. So they contacted the Willows again, and they were able to adopt my mother, who was Wanda Keller, and she was born on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1925. And that is where the title of my book about My Little Valentine comes from. They brought her home, and of course, immediately what happens, grandma got pregnant again, and she ended up having two sisters. So there were 5 children. This is the letter that was actually from the Willows that my grandmother received. And it says, this was after they had brought her home and the adoption papers had been finalized, and said, "I'm very glad to know that the baby is getting along so well, and she must be a fine big girl. She now weighs 14 pounds, Mrs. Nellie McEwen." And it's been fun to read these letters, especially with Mrs. Nellie McEwen, because I've actually met the granddaughter of Nellie McEwen, who was also adopted from the Willows. This is just a picture of my mother with her 4 other siblings. 2 of the 5 were adopted and 3 of them naturally born. My grandparents were wonderful in that they were all there was no distinction between who was adopted and which was natural born. They had a wonderful life, and my mom always was very happy that she was raised on this farm. She felt very blessed that she had this wonderful life, and that she, because she had been adopted into this wonderful family. But there wasn't a day that went by that my mom didn't have that question. She just always wanted to know who she was, what her background was, who was her birth mother. And my mom always did a lot of searching throughout her life. When she turned 18, my grandparents gave her all of her adoption papers. And my mother knew from an early age that she was adopted. There was no keeping it a secret from her. So when she turned 18 and she got these documents, One of the things that helped her was to know where she was born. And she got the letter from the Willows that was explaining that she was born in Kansas City, Missouri. It didn't really give her any other information, though, as far as where her birth mother was from. But within this information that she did have her name, and her birth name was Marcie Hendrickson. And so through this was her adopted papers that was going through the legal courts. And it had my grandparents' names instead of her birth parents' names on this. So she knew her last name was Hendrickson. But then about the who and the why, she never did really know any more about it. She always had that question. There were two documents that my mother had for my grandparents, and what they were called the Wasserman blood test, where they would check to see if they were social diseases. This is for her because it has her name Marcia on it, which was her name given at birth. But the other one was given to my grandparents was the mother's Wasserman blood test. And as you can see on it, it has patient's name was Leona May. So my mother was able to deduce that her mother's name was Leona May. This was probably a mistake. They probably should have redacted the name on this, but whole life then my mom assumed that her mother's name was Leona May Hendrickson. So she searched for 66 years trying to find anything she could find out about her birth mother with no luck. And it was interesting, as we would travel around on vacations and things, my mom would go into the room, and she'd get out the phone book and she'd start looking through the phone book, seeing if she could find anyone with the last name of Hendrickson. And she would write letters to different people if she found somebody with that last name, but she just never had any luck with it. But she always had this desire. She just really wanted to search. Well, by accident, my search for Leona May started in March of 1991. I was teaching school in Topeka at the time, and I was doing some research about Topeka, and I went to the Historical Society and I found out how you could search the censuses. And we always assumed my mom was from Missouri since she was born there. We didn't know that what state her birth mother was actually from. But while I was there, I'm going, I wonder if she could have been from Kansas. So I started thinking back to the documents my mother had given to my sisters and me on our Christmas of this past year in 1990, just to give us copies of all of her adoption papers. And one of the things that was in there was this document from the Willows Maternity Sanitarium that said her birth mother was 17 years old. Well, that helped me kind of click in my head that, well, she must have been born in about 1907 or 1908, because my mom was born in 1925. And so I went to the census and I started looking in the 1910 census for the last name Hendrickson in Kansas. Well, the lady who was showing me how to run the microfiche, this is prior to the computer days, she said, all of the good and bad news is that all of the counties are alphabetical and all of the letters of the alphabet are alphabetical. But when you get to the H's, if you're looking for Hendrickson, within every county, they're not in alphabetical order anymore. So I had to search through the census until I could find a Hendrickson under the H's. I looked for 2 different days sitting in this chair going through this until eventually I found in Montgomery County, there was a Hendrickson, and they had a baby girl who was 3 years old whose name was Ona, O-N-A. And I thought, wow, that's very close. So I went to the 1915 census and I went straight to Montgomery County. I found the H's and I found the Hendrickson family again. This time it said her name was Leona. So I'm thinking, wow, this has to be getting close. So it said that she was born in Havana, Kansas, and Havana is in Southeast Kansas. And being from a small town myself, I knew who knows more about anybody in your town, the postmistress. So I called the post office and asked. They didn't know anyone named Hendrickson in the town, but she told me that there was a man in town. His name was Bus Wade. And if anybody knew anything about the Hendricksons, it would be him. And that he knew everybody living and dead is what she told me. And she actually gave me his phone number. So I called and talked to them, and Bus was really, really nice about everything. And he said, yes, there had been Hendricksons who lived in the town. There was a Hendrickson family. He said, in the cemetery, there's actually a Clark Hendrickson and an Anna Hendrickson buried there. And he said, I didn't really know them, but I knew some of the family, some of the kids. And he said, in fact, one of the relatives of the Hendricksons lives in Wichita. He was in my class. His name was Claude Hendrickson, and he would be a cousin. Now, I didn't tell them why I was searching, just that I was searching for the family tree and some genealogical research. I didn't ever mention that I was looking for my birth. So Bud says, well, you know what? I think I have Claude's phone number. So this wouldn't happen today, but in 1991, he went and got the phone number and gave me the phone. And so I called Claude, and I'm telling him I'm doing this research on the family tree. I think I might be related. Long story short, he eventually told me that Leona and her brother Bud were both still living and were in California. And they lived in Doris, California. And he said her name was Leona May Britches now. And so I'm all excited because this is the first time I've actually heard the name Leona May. And I didn't know if I still had the right person or not, but it's feeling pretty good. I've not told anybody else in the family that I'm doing any of this research at this point. So the next thing I did, I tried to call and get information. There was no Leona May Britches listed at all in Doris, California. So I ended up, Claude told me he would pass on the information to all of his relatives that I was doing research. And if any of them wanted to contact me, they could. I was hoping he'd give me Leona's phone number, but he didn't. So needless to say, I was very anxious, hoping to hear from her. Well, I did. I got a letter from her, and she said that she wasn't interested in the family tree, but if I wanted to contact her, here was her phone number and here was her address. So I wrote to her, explained to her why I was writing. I didn't know if she was the right Leona. I hadn't told my mom. I didn't want to interfere in her life, but my mom had always wanted to find her birth mother. And if it was her, we would love to meet her. Well, she wrote me back and she said, yes, I think I'm the Leona May you're looking for. And then she says in her letter, this was one subject never talked about, but never forgotten. And I actually called Leona then that night after she gave me her phone number. And she was telling me, all about why she had given my mother up. She was only 16 when she got pregnant and the whole story. Also, she said that she's not told anybody else that she ever had a baby except for her husband. And she really didn't want to let this out, but she would love to meet my mom. So I had to tell my mom, and it's long story short on that as well, was, it was a wonderful time for her to actually get a phone call and call Leona and talk to her herself. This is a picture of Leona May when she was young. And then when we found her in 1991, when she was 83 years old. And it was funny because her last name was Bretches, not Britches, the way he had spelled it to me. And Leona laughed and she said, yeah, he always spelled my name wrong. So we actually called and talked to Leona that night. And within 2 weeks, we had made plans and arrangements. And my mother and I flew to California from Kansas. And we met Leona at the airport where she picked us up. And we went and spent almost 2 weeks with her. And they just had a wonderful time together. My mom was 66 and she was 83 years old. So the answer to the why was actually told to my mom that Leona had gotten pregnant at 16. Her birth father, her father had died, and the stepfather was very mean and would not allow them to go to like the dances. So Leona would hide her good dress in the rafters of the outhouse, sneak out the window at night and go to the dance. And she actually met a young guy that she said was the handsomest man she'd ever seen. And one thing led to another, and Leona ended up getting pregnant. And that was the why, or how she ended up being pregnant at such a young age. I put this picture in here because I wanted to show you the comparison. The woman on the left is Leona, the one on the right is my mother, and you can see the resemblance that they did have. Leona told us about my mother's birth father, and his name was Burgee Belt. And Burgee was 21 years old. And come to find out, when Leona got far enough along in her pregnancy that she had to tell somebody because she was so scared to death, her brother took her over to this boy's farm, and his father was a wealthy farmer. And he came out to talk to them. The father of this boy did. Well, come to find out, Burgee had gotten married. This is a copy of his wedding announcement that was handed out to the people, showing that he had gotten married on August the 9th. And she found out that that his wife was also pregnant. So not only was my grandma pregnant, but also Virgie's wife was pregnant. And my mother has a half sister who was 4 months to the day younger than her. Well, needless to say, this didn't go over too well. But Virgie's father was the one then who paid for the way for Leona to go to the Willows to have this baby, to take care of this little problem. Leona really had no other alternative. She didn't have the money. And so he paid for her to go and stay at the Willows. Once they got to know one another, my mother and Leona found it so fascinating that they had so many things that were in common. So one of the things that they both loved to do was to fish. And Leona and Wanda had many, many stories that they shared about going fishing, and they actually even got to go fishing together. They also loved to both hunt. Now, my mother was really a tomboy, and her two sisters loved to cook and stay in the house and help in the house, where my mom would rather be out working with the boys and hunting and fishing. So they loved the fact that they had this in common, even though she didn't raise my mother. They both also loved to garden, and this is Leona's garden and my mom's garden. And they both loved to bake. And so when Leona came out to the farm, she came to Kansas several times to visit my mom. They would bake together, and they really had a wonderful time just getting to know one another and spending time. We also got to know the extended family. Like I said, Leona was a little nervous at first telling anybody who we were. In fact, when we first went to go visit her, she said, "Would it be okay if I just said you were friends from Kansas?" And I said, "Sure." I said, "We're from Kansas, and we're friends, so fine." So she didn't tell anybody that my mother was actually her daughter and that I was her grandson. And it took her several months to really come around to the point that she was comfortable, because she felt like she had this big secret that she'd never told anybody. And the only person that knew anything about that my mother had been born was her brother, Bud, who is in the bottom picture here, when the bottom bottom left picture. And we found it interesting because all of her relatives, once we got to know them, said, "We never understood why Leona could never hold a baby. Whenever somebody in the family had a baby, they'd try to get her to hold it. She said, no, I'll drop it. I don't want to drop it." And it wasn't until the child was like 1 or 2 years old that she warmed up to them and had any kind of connection where she would hold them. But when we talked to Leona about that, she said, "I just couldn't hold a baby. I'd had my baby Marcia for 10 days and was nursing her. And then I had to leave her there and give her up for adoption. And I just couldn't handle holding a baby because it brought back too many memories." Then we also met my mother's father's side of the family. Once we knew who he was, I did some more researching and searched and found that my mother had 3 half sisters, and she had had 2 half brothers who both had passed away. And her half sister, the one that was just 4 months younger than her, she and my mother looked quite a bit alike. And her youngest half sister, Susie, was actually only 3 years older than me. And I was the youngest in the family. So there was 36 years difference between my mother and her youngest half sister. And then she also met a first cousin whose name was Charles. And it was just incredible, the relationship that they developed. Charles and his wife, Dolores, were from California. They came to Kansas and heard about my mom, and they asked if they could come up and meet her. They ended up meeting and had a wonderful relationship that they developed, and they actually became travel companions. And my mom and dad went with them to Florida, and they went to Canada together, and they just developed a wonderful relationship that they had over the years that they had together. The way I got started deciding I was going to write a book was in 2014. After my mother had passed away, I found hundreds of letters from Leona that she had written to Wanda, my mother, over those 13 years that they had together. And I started studying these letters, and I found out things that I had no idea that Grandma had shared with my mom. And I was telling some of the people that I worked with and family and friends as I would read these letters. One of my friends said, "KelLee, you need to write this down. This is fascinating." She says, "Nothing else. It's just for your family and for your friends to have it documented, because they're not going to go back and read all of these letters. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. And I started writing and putting this all together. Fortunately, my mother had all these letters in chronological order. And so it was really fascinating. And there were so many things that I learned. So it became a book called My Little Valentine, The Story of a Mother and Daughter's Lost Love. And one of the things in the story that I learned through the letters was this little necklace that I put on the cover of the book. I never actually saw the necklace, but in one of the letters, my grandma said that after the visit that we were there the very first time, she went into her bedroom and went into her dresser and she saw this little box. And she said she opened it and she just had to sit down because when she opened it, there was this little gold necklace that my mother had left for her with a card. And on the necklace, it says, "Together we are complete." And I never knew that my mother had even taken that necklace or given it to her. But my grandma said in her letter that she would never take that little necklace off. So it was things like that that I had learned that I put into the book to share about the relationship that they developed. And so it was very interesting to just learn so many things and the relationship that they developed. It's funny because they often laughed because they were both very strong-willed, kind of hard-headed women. And they laughed about the fact that it's probably a good thing that my grandma, Emma, raised her because grandma was such a patient, caring, loving person that was less likely to have butted heads with my mom. And she said, Leona and my mom said they probably would have had a really rough time during those teenage years because they were so much alike. So after the book, My Little Valentine, came out, I started hearing from a lot of different people who read my book and found out more and more people were born at the Willows. I also, when I was writing the book, didn't know what the Willows was. I actually had written a chapter just sort of assuming that the Willows was maybe a boarding house where a few girls stayed and that were pregnant and gave their babies up for adoption. And I wrote the chapter sort of that way because I never asked my grandma much about the Willows. All she ever told us was that it was a very difficult time in her life, but the people at the Willows treated her extremely nicely and she was treated very well. And for such a difficult situation that it really wasn't, it was really made it much more tolerable than what it could have been. So I was very pleased to learn about the Willows, that she was happy about it. But one of the ladies who had edited my book, she said, "KelLee, do you really know anything about the Willows?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, let's start researching." So that's when I started to research about the Willows and I started to learn more about it and found out that it was really this big, gigantic facility. As I started writing or reading and researching more, I contacted the Kansas City Public Library and I got everything I could read about the Willows. And I was fascinated to learn that this was a facility that could hold over 100 girls at a time. I mean, that just blew my mind to think that it was such a huge facility that they actually delivered the babies there. So I ended up, from all the research that I did, I ended up writing another book and just the history of the Willows. And there were a lot of misinformation that was out there that I was able to kind of clear up. So I found out that Kansas City had been called, in the adoption world in the early 1900s, the adoption hub of America. And they said that in the early mid 1900s, over 100,000 babies were born in Kansas City and given up for adoption. Now, this was Kansas City, Missouri, because Missouri had closed records. Kansas is one of the few states that had open records. And so it was more important that why Kansas City, Missouri was the one that was known as the adoption hub. So why Kansas City? Well, it was centrally located in the United States, so it was very easy to get to. This will show you a map that was from the 1920s that the Willows actually put out that showed the girls that came from different states. In 1920, were 353 residents from 26 different states, and they would come from these states by train. And you can see here that they had Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Illinois, the states closest to Kansas City had the most girls, but they came from all over: New York, California, West Virginia, and they came by train. Kansas City had a very large hub where the trains could come from all different locations. My grandma came to Kansas City by train from Southeast Kansas. My grandparents went to Kansas City by train to adopt my mom. So in the earlier days, that was the way a lot of the girls got there. Later on at the Willows, people even flew in from other countries to stay at the Willows. It was so well known nationally and internationally. The railroad station in Kansas City, the Union Station, was a big, gigantic facility, and it was the second largest train station in the United States in the early 1900s. And I always found this quite fascinating as I was researching it, that the annual passenger traffic peak was 678,000 in 1945. But I'm just trying to imagine what it must have been like for my grandmother to be a 16-year-old girl and come into this big, gigantic mammoth building, scared to death, going to some place she'd never been. She'd never been to Kansas City. She'd never been to a big city. She was a farm girl, and have to walk through this facility and just be scared to death, trying to find her way to the Willows. The other thing that made Kansas City the adoption hub was their adoption system. And this was kind of put into place early on. They had a statewide system that everybody in Missouri followed, and it was a very simplified court adoption system. It sort of started later on in the 20s, 30s, and especially in the 40s. But this was an article that I found that was written in the Chicago Sunday Tribune, and it's talking about Kansas City in the 1950s and why it was sort of the adoption hub. It says there's one city, however, that has solved its own black market baby problems by devising a simplified court adoption system that has gained a nationwide reputation for its high standards, fine work, and success in the child placement field. That's Kansas City, Missouri. The adoption court there places about 1,000 babies a year, thus making it one of the largest and possibly the largest child placement agency in America. In the latter years, like in the 40s and 50s, they actually had social workers at the facilities. There were many, many facilities in Kansas City. So the social workers actually had an office at the Willows. And we also found that as we were trying to help different people do some searching for their birth certificates, find out where they were born and who their birth parents were, sometimes the information on their birth certificates said one place where they were born, but they actually had documentation showing that they were born like at the Willows versus the Fairmont. So it was interesting, I think, because social workers were kind of working within all these different facilities, that sometimes they would bring a baby from one facility that was born one place over to another one where they were adopted. They also had sealed records that were sealed in 1941. And so after that point, the records were no longer open. So the records were closed and unavailable to adoptees. It provided protection in their minds for the birth parents' identities so that if an adoptee wanted to go look for their birth parents, they weren't able to. And it provided protection for the adoptive parents so that if a birth mother or birth father decided they wanted to try to get back their child, they wouldn't be able to find out who the adoptive parents were or what the name of their child was now that once it was adopted. Missouri laws changed slowly over time. Now in 2011, they were able to open up the information to get the non-identifying information that would help to give a little bit of clues about who their parents were, what they were, maybe where they were from. But both parents had to sign off on it before that non-identifying information could be given to the adoptee as they were searching. Then in August 26, 2016, the law was changed where a child could get their non-certified original birth certificate, which would help the child to be able to find out who their birth mother was, hopefully their birth father, because sometimes that birth father's name was not correct or it was blank, and also was helping them to see where they were from or what their city was from that could help them, or their state. And in the early time when this first came up, only adoptees could get their birth certificates if they were born before 1941, because there was a huge backlog of people wanting to get their original birth certificates. And it wasn't until January 1st of 2018 that people were able to get their birth certificates that were older than 1941. Then in 2018, the lineal descendants were added to this. So for me, if I wanted to get my mother's birth certificate, I could fill out the paperwork if I could show a death certificate for my mother and be able to get my mother's original birth certificate. And I've been surprised how many grandchildren of people who were born at the Willows have been asking how to go about getting this lineal descendant information, that a lot of grandchildren really want to find out more about their grandparents and where their birth grandparents were from. So there were many facilities in Kansas City for pregnant unwed girls, and they were all mostly located very close to the Union Station. This is just to name a few of the facilities. There were even more than this. I won't go through all of these names, but it was just shocking to me to learn that there were so many facilities, and some of them were there for quite some time, like the Willows. And then there were others that they would open up and they would close, or they would get in trouble with the health department. And so they would close and open up under another name. The Veil was one of the ones that I've learned a lot more about that really was pretty shady and went under several different names over the time that it was there. I'll just show you some pictures of the different facilities. This is the Fairmont Maternity Hospital. This one actually moved around a couple of times, and there were a couple of different names of hospitals in this actual facility. But it was one of the larger ones, similar to the Willows as far as size. There was the Kansas City Cradle. Now, this was not for the maternity home, but this was where babies were placed for adoption. They would go to the East Side Hospital, usually the girls, to have their babies, and then the babies were brought here. St. Vincent's Hospital was a Catholic hospital, and they had St. Anthony's was where the babies would be adopted from. There was Florence Crittenton Home for Girls, which there are Florence Crittentons all over the United States, and several of them are still even open today. And there was Florence Crittenton Home for Colored Girls that was in Kansas City at one time. And there were several others, including the largest Kansas City facility that was known as the Ritz or the Waldorf of the maternity homes. And that was the Willows Maternity Sanitarium. And here again is another picture of it. And you can see how large it was. And originally that part that's in the middle with the windows at the top, that was the original house. That was the mansion that was started, the whole thing. And they just kept adding different sections onto the building. The maternity ward was on the second floor, and the baby's cribs was on the top floor where those windows are. And they had a roof garden nursery as well. There were also several other large Victorian style houses on the property where some of the girls could stay. And there were different prices depending on where you stayed as to how expensive it was. But all of the girls that came here, they were paying for themselves. There was no charity. They were pretty much more upper to middle to upper middle class girls or upper class girls. They had to be able to afford to stay here. They actually said it was as expensive to live at the Willows as it was to go to a boarding school. And so it was very expensive to stay there. But the people who ran the Willows didn't take any charity. They didn't take any money from the government. They wouldn't take any philanthropic money. They ran it solely on what they charged the girls to stay there. The couple who started it were E.P. and Cora May Haworth. They started in 1905 because they had a friend whose daughter became pregnant, and they were going to send this girl off to have her baby and give it up for adoption so no one would know. And Cora May and EP said, why don't you let her come and stay with us? And they helped her, and then they helped her to find a place for being adopted. They were Quakers, and they felt this was their mission in life, to help young women so that their lives weren't ruined in their minds at that time period, because the way society treated young women at that time, they would be ostracized and they could have just a horrible life, and they really couldn't raise a child on their own in those days. And so they took it upon themselves, thinking that this was their mission that they were called to in life. It's estimated that between 25 and 35,000, about 30,000 babies were actually born at the Willows from 1905 to 1969 when it closed. This again is a picture of the facility that when it first started in 1908, when they purchased this building, they'd had 2 other homes before that where they had had girls stay with them. But this was a rich man named Asa Maddox's home that was a mansion that was, after he passed away, his widow sold it to the Haworths and they turned it into the Willows Maternity Sanitarium. This is a picture of them standing in the front of the building in 1910, and there's a tent there in the back of the building, and that was where the nurses stayed. And I thought it was very interesting to learn. They actually had their own corps of nurses who helped take care of all of the women and the babies that were there. And it was very interesting how they handled the whole situation. Now I've just got a few pictures that I'll show you of the facility. This is Mr. and Mrs. Haworth. This is their office where the parents would come in if they were adopting. This was what a patient's rooms looked like. And they tried to keep things up to date and increase the amount of money that they put into it to really keep it up to speed with the time period. They had a full stock kitchen, and they cooked all of the meals right there. They had a dining hall where the girls would all in the basement. The girls would all come down to the basement. Mrs. Haworth was a real stickler about etiquette and was really teaching the girls as well about how to dine and how to use etiquette when they're eating. And the meals were all served sort of buffet style, from what I understand. They'd walk through and pick their food up. But from the different women that I spoke to, some of them said, oh, the food wasn't very good. But most of them said, it really wasn't too bad. The only thing that they complained about was they weren't allowed to use much salt. And one lady told me, Diane told me she actually had her own salt shaker that she hid, and she would salt her own food. This is the roof garden nursery, and you can see the rows and rows and rows of babies. That one time they could have up to 125 infants at the facility. They had a washroom where they would wash the infants and they'd give them their baths, and they would weigh the babies and kept very, very detailed information about the babies. They also had this area called the bullpen, and all of the women I spoke to, including my grandma, said this was their favorite place to be. It was next to the building, had a high fence so nobody could see in. In the early days, they actually called it a seclusion hospital. The girls weren't allowed to leave here in the early days, and nobody ever saw them. And they could go into this area and walk around the path, sit out on the benches, and this was their one little oasis where they could get away. I put this picture in because I loved showing these steps that are at the front of the building. Everyone talks about how they had to go up these tall steps to get to the entrance to the building. Now, only the people adopting came in through the front. The girls all came in through the back. And when they would come to the Union Station on the train, they would get onto either a taxi or they could come by trolley up to the Willows. It's only a few blocks away from the Union Station. But the taxi drivers all knew that if they were given 2929 Main Street as the address, that they were to come around to the back and let the girls out at the back. They also had their own staff of nurses, as I said before, and Mr. Haworth was a prolific writer, and he put all kinds of information out, and he would show pictures of the different groups of women who were the nurses and the doctors there. And it was pretty brilliant that they actually opened up their own nursing school that was for infant nursing. And so they would train nurses, and girls would come from all over the country to be going to this nursing school. And while they were in school, they would help to take care of the babies that were there with the unwed mothers. They also did a lot of advertising. These advertisements I found were some that were in medical journals. And they really advertised strictly to doctors and would send a lot of information out to doctors. And they'd have a 90-page brochure showing all about their facility and talked about what their philosophy was and what they were trying to do to help these girls to not have their lives ruined. And as I mentioned, Mr. Haworth did this 10-year survey, and every 10 years he would put this document out and would have what the denomination the girls were of the churches that they attended, what their background was, what their jobs were that they did, how many of them were still schoolgirls, the ages of the girls. The ages were as low as 12 years old of some of the girls in the early 1900s that were there. And I've actually heard of some of the girls that were as old as 30, and 39 was the oldest one that I've ever heard. There were also married women who came to the Willows, and it wasn't necessary that they had to give the babies up for adoption either. Sometimes the girls actually kept their babies. So it wasn't like they came, they had to give their babies up. But a lot of times the women said they felt they had no choice. They had calendars that they gave to the doctors that they would send out, just advertising the Willows. And like I said, Mr. Haworth was a very prolific writer. And this is actually not a diary by Elizabeth. This is a diary that he wrote himself, telling as if he was a young girl who got into trouble and ended up coming to the Willows. And it's a whole interesting story that he wrote with all the graphics and everything. And it tells all about what it's like at the Willows and what you would experience, so that they would give this to doctors and people who were going to send girls to their facility so they would know what to expect. This is another one. She is one of us. It explains all about their philosophy. Bypass and Crossroads, another one that he wrote explaining all of the things. And these would be 30, 40, 50 page documentations of them. When they, in the 20s, they were no longer able to advertise babies in the newspaper. It was made a law. And so then they started putting out a documentation that was called Baby Bears. Mrs. Haworth actually wrote this herself, and it talked about the babies that they had, and families shared about their adopting the babies and what it was like to be able to adopt. In 1953, Mrs. Haworth, Cora May, passed away, and their daughter-in-law, Peggy Haworth, took over running the Willows, and she kept it open until 1969. So the Haworth family kept it open from the beginning to the end. No one else had control of the facility. When I was searching for more information, I came across this photo, and it had actually been in the newspaper. And this is Peggy and her husband, Don. Don was Cora May and E.P.'s son, and their daughter, Carol. And it's fascinating because Carol was actually a Willows baby as well. She was adopted in 1944 by Peggy and Don. And I did a little search, and I found on Facebook, I found Carol, and wrote to her and told her that what I was doing, and that I thanked her because my mom was so appreciative of the fact that she had wonderful parents that raised her, and wanted to thank her for having the family that we ended up having. She wrote me back, and she appreciated that I had said that. And we ended up becoming very good friends. Carol started sharing with me lots and lots of information, and all the documentation that she had that her father and her grandfather had written. And so it was through Carol that I was able to really write the book. Carol's story is actually in my second book, also Mansion on the Hill. And still to this day, Carol and I stay in touch, and we talk almost every week. But it's been really interesting. She's very proud of her family and the background and what they actually did and why they were doing it. So in the back half of my book, I have a section called Voice of the Willows. And I have 10 stories in the Mansion of the Hill that are people who had a connection to the Willows. They were either born there, or they had given birth there, or like Carol's story is in there. And these people had contacted me after they had read my first book. And they said, if you ever write a book, we'd love to share our stories. And so I said, I'd really like to be able to help them to document their own stories, because it meant so much to my family to actually have my mom's story documented. And so one of the stories that is in Mansion on the Hill is Anita's story. And Anita contacted me after she had read my book, and she lived in California. And she said that she had been born at the Willows, and her story is really interesting. She sent me a picture. This was her biological mother that she had actually been able to meet and got to know her. And her adoptive parents were very, very intelligent people who were actually archaeologists, and they'd traveled all over the world. And Anita had a very, very fascinating life. And her father loved to make movies. And in the 40s, she was born in 1949, I believe. And he had taken film after film and film of movies. And so she said, I think I have a film, a 16 millimeter film that my dad took when they picked me up at the Willows. And I said, wow, that's incredible. I said, do you still have it? And she said, I don't know where it is. I know I've got it. I said, well, if you ever find it, let me know. I would love to help you to get it put onto something that we could actually see. She actually was moving from one place to another. And in the process of moving, she came across this film, and she was able to send it to me. And I had this film made. This is going to show you a film of her father, her adoptive father and mother, coming to the Willows to pick up Anita when she was an infant. Again, this is about 1949. This is her adoptive mother. And this is those steps going up to the Willows. Now, he had the camera sitting on a tripod, and he'd have to move the tripod every time he wanted to film a different section. Here they're leaving. And of course, they couldn't take pictures inside the building because they had to keep the privacy of the girls. And that's Anita when she was just a baby, as after she'd been adopted. And here's her father carrying her down the steps. Like I said, he had to move the tripod every time he wanted to film a different section. No car seats in those days. Put the bassinet in the back seat. This is my favorite part coming up. Of course, he had to put the trifold in front of the car and then show them driving off, and then stop and pick up the trifold and get the camera. So that basically, let me see where we're doing on time, right about 7. So I ended up writing a third book. And this one is called More Voices of the Willows, the Adoption Hub of America. Because after Mansion on a Hill came out, there were so many people who contacted me who had been born at the Willows. With that many babies born there, you can imagine. And so I started hearing from more and more people. I also started learning more things about the Willows that I didn't know before. And so I ended up writing the third book. And the third book includes more information about the Willows that I had learned. In the first book about Mansion, one of the big myths was that all of the records have been taken out into the backyard and burned after they closed the Willows. Well, that wasn't true. They did try to take the records over to the courthouse, and the courthouse didn't want them. They told them to take the records over to the Federal Reserve building, and that's what they did with them. And they assumed they were probably destroyed, but they weren't taken in the backyard and burned. So in the last book, there's more information about the Willows, more information about several of the other facilities besides the Willows. And then there's 22 more stories about people who have a connection to the Willows. They were born there, they were adopted there. There were birth mothers. There's a couple of stories from people that went to different facilities. And there's 2 young women whose mother was a nurse there. And they were like 4 and 6 years old when they lived at the Willows and had a room. They had an apartment in the Willows and were right there with the girls. So their viewpoint was completely different as well. And at the very bottom, of the book, I always wondered with that many people, if there was ever anybody who was famous or had an interesting background. Well, one lady wrote to me and she said, my father was born at the Willows. And this is a picture of her father when he was adopted and his parents. Well, it turned out he was the Kansas governor, Robert Bennett. And he was very, very proud of the fact that he was born at the Willows and that he was an adoptee. And she said that it was very interesting in the fact that he never was very pleased with any of her boyfriends until she met her future husband, and his name was also Bob. And the fact that they were both Bob kind of was one little bit thing that gave him an inside line to her dad. But then her husband was adopted as well. And so they had this bond about the fact that they were both adopted. Well, come to find out, they figured out that this lady's husband was also born at the Willows. So not only was her father, but also her husband were both born at the Willows. So that's a picture of Governor Robert Bennett. And he tells his story, and it's called The Brass Button, that he had written earlier, and his daughter allowed me to put it in the book. So that's basically my story. And I guess we will now start talking about questions that we might have.
Okay, who would like to open up with a question? Oh my goodness, KelLee, that was your story.
No, thank
Amazing.
you.
And all that research that you did. I had no idea. I hadn't even heard about the Willows until I met you. So I think Sharon has, and there might be some others here that have heard about it, but this is the first that I've heard about it. But what an amazing journey for you as a non-adopted person.
Really. It's interesting for me. I think as a person whose mother was adopted, to really see the change in her after she found her birth mother. She really was kind of insecure. She was a very strong-willed person, but she still had this insecurity. She just never had this knowing of who she was.
Right.
And she always talked to us about that. And as children of an adoptee, I think we saw that. But it wasn't until after she met my grandma Leona that I really saw this transformation in her. And I started to understand a little bit better what she felt that we didn't really ever understand before. So.
Yeah, and I just one of the reasons why I thought I would love to have you on this evening is we haven't talked a lot about on Happy Hour at this point about how adoption affects the non-adopted, the extended family. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, that was.
I've really been surprised how many people have contacted me who are grandchildren of adoptees and that are really wanting to search and find more information. And a lot of them, their grandparents or have already passed away, or their mother and father have passed away, and they're still trying to search, even though they weren't adopted themselves. They still want to know that heritage. Yeah. One of the stories in my book, in the last book, is by Linda, and Sharon had a really huge part in helping Linda to find her story. And I know Sharon's probably told this story before, but I love Linda's story because Linda's parents were actually married when she was sent to the Willows to have her baby. And she was like 18, and they were not allowed by her parents to have the baby, to keep the baby. And they ended up getting married again. They ran off and eloped and got married and were going to keep the baby, and the grandmother would not allow them. And so they ended up getting married a year later to the day. And they had 3 more children. I think it was, Sharon. Is that right? Mm-hmm. 3 children.
Yes, 3 more, I think. Mm-hmm.
And so she had 2 full brothers and a full sister. And she found her parents. Sharon found them, they were like 90, in their 90s?
Real close, yes. Most exciting, yes. It was really great.
So her story is in the book. It's really fun. It's really fun to share. I really have enjoyed helping people document their stories. I think that's been the best part for me, is just meeting so many wonderful people and helping them to be able to write their story down and know that it's there for other people to read. So I've really enjoyed that. That's been fun. I have 10 people now who have told me if I ever write another book. So I've been joking. I said, well, I'm going to have to if I write another book, it's going to have to be more and more story of the Willows, voices of the Willows. So.
Sharon, did you have a question?
I did. Just a comment. I think that's probably what I think is most helpful in hearing all about these 3 books that I have read is that the younger generation that's adopted now cannot understand how we as birth parents in the 50s and 60s could do that. And I think that these books really show why we did, that we felt like that was our only choice. And I just think that it's nice to hear stories that confirm what our feelings were, because so many people nowadays cannot understand that. So I really appreciate all these books.
Oh, thank you.
Peter?
Yeah. Thanks, Kel. That's just an amazing story, amazing journey, amazing research. I think we're kindred spirits in the research department, and I empathise with your mother as to 66 years of searching. It took me 6 weeks, and it was the longest 6 weeks of my life. I don't know how I would have coped with 66 years. I also want to reiterate that we haven't spoken here about children and grandchildren of adoptees, and I'm the president of Adoptee Rights Australia, and I'm getting more and more contact from children and grandchildren of adoptees wanting to find it's their right as much as ours to know our history and our families, and it's our genetics, and it's a little wonder, you say after they've died they're still looking. Of course, it's their story as well as our stories as adoptees, our children, our grandchildren's story, and beyond that. It's something that doesn't get talked about, but it is. No, thank you again for sharing today.
Oh, thank you. It really does. I really hadn't thought too much about how much it affected me as a child and my sisters, but I really have, the more I've talked to more people, really did realize that my mom's feelings and what she went through really did have some effect on us as well, and just the relationship that she had with us. So like I said, it really made a big difference to me after I saw this whole transformation of my mother after she met Grandma Leona, and she loved her folks, and it wasn't anything like that. Other thing I found so fascinating, everyone I've talked about, I would say almost every single one to the person has said their biggest fear in searching for their birth parents has been not to hurt their adoptive parents' feelings. And I know that was my mother's feelings. And she really didn't say anything, even though my grandparents told her it was okay for her to search. She didn't ever really talk about it or tell them. And my grandfather passed away when he was 100 years old. And it was New Year's Eve of 1990. And we found Grandma Leona in 1991, about 4 months later. And so I've always said, I really wish my grandma Emma could have known my grandma Leona, because they would have really loved one another. And I know they would have appreciated one another greatly. So I do wish they would have had an opportunity to have met and got to know each other.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Comments? Now, KelLee, from the time that you started the search until you found your grandmother, what was that time frame again?
I started searching. It was actually my first year of teaching, and it was during spring break. So it was around March when I started searching. And so I started contacting different people, and it was shortly right after I got out of school when I sent the letters to her. And I went to Florida to visit my sister, and there was about 2 weeks that I was gone. When I got back, the letter was sitting there waiting for me. So it was like July when we actually made the phone call back and forth. I think the letter was dated June 29th. And she was really nervous because she thought that after she sent the letter that I didn't want to contact her, that I was disappointed because but I wasn't home to write her or to call her. And so that was kind of interesting. But then it was in August when we went to go visit her. So it was really started in March, and we met her in August. So it was very quick once we actually really got started. But this is before there was Google searches and DNA testing and all that. I always have said it was really kind of divine intervention or just plain good luck that I was able to come across her. And the fact that she was from Kansas, you know, we didn't know what state she was from. So.
Wow. And all these letters from Leona.
Yes. Well, they wrote back and forth to one another constantly, visited each other. They probably talked on the phone every other day. They really did develop a really good relationship. And one of the bonding things that they did the first time that we went out, I don't know if you remember seeing in the picture, but Leona had dyed her hair. She always kind of dyed it, and it was a little reddish tint instead of brown. And she was so embarrassed that her hair was red. And my mom said, you know, you look great. You know, she says, you look younger than me, because my mom had gray hair. But Leona hadn't been able to get her perm before we got there. So one of the things that my mom and Grandma Leona did was my mom gave her a perm. And that was like a real bonding thing for them to be able to do that for one another when they were there the very first time. So my mom gave her a perm.
How, you know, just how awesome to be a part of this. I mean, that, you know, congratulations on the search and the reunion and that wonderful relationship that they shared. What, 13 years, right?
13 years that they had. Yeah. My grandma passed when she was 96. And so they had a lot of time to spend with one another. And it was interesting learning the relationship that they developed with at the beginning. I said Leona had raised a son and a daughter. They were her sister's children. And so she didn't ever have any of her own kids because she said she didn't want to have any children if she couldn't have my mom. But she had never, of course, told the son and daughter that she had raised that were, I think they were 6 and 8 when she started raising them. The daughter was very receptive when my grandma told her, and it was almost 6 months before she told her that we had found her. The son was angry, and he actually didn't speak to her for almost a month. He was so mad that she never told him that she'd had a baby. But he eventually came around, and that was another thing that was in the letters that I read. She was telling us that his name was Orville. He came around and he was apologizing for the way he acted. But he said, you were my mom, you know, after my mom died. He says, I didn't want to share you with some stranger. And so it was very interesting. And when we first were there, there was like 1 or 2 pictures on the mantle. And like I said, she didn't want to tell anybody, but within probably a year, her whole mantle was filled with all of our family's pictures. She was very proud of all of us. So she went from having no basic children to having a daughter and 3 grandchildren and great grandkids. So, yeah.
Wow, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate having you on this evening and joining us for happy hour.
Oh, thank you.
Do we have any final questions for KelLee before we move for closing for the evening?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
People are thanking you and talking about good job on your presentation. The presentation is pretty awesome. Hi, Zoom user. You have a question?
I don't know if you have me on. It's Paul Kimball.
Hey, Paul.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. It's been a while.
It has been a while.
On the Friday afternoons. KelLee, that story is so moving because you're right. We often think of our own adoption stories as just us. Mm-hmm. But so much love in your family. It's really beautiful because it's such a sensitive subject. And you're right, we do affect our children, and you are your mom's child, and to do that for her must have been so healing for you and her, and extended your grandmother's life, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that was very special. And I've heard that from many times, people telling me, that must have been really special for your mom. My mom was a crier, and drop of a hat, anything could happen and she would just cry because she's a very emotional person. So you can imagine when I went out to tell her that that I had found her mom after all that time. And one of the things I tell in the book is I share how when I went out to tell her, I got back from Florida and I stopped to visit her, and she was working, and I said, I was home, I'm glad to be home. And she said to me, I've decided I'm going to quit working. She said, I want to start seeing if I can't hire a lawyer and see if I can't find my birth mother. And here I'd already just found her and had talked to her the night before. And I couldn't tell her because she was working, and I knew she'd be a mess if I told her right there while she was working. So I waited till I got home. I told my dad, and my dad was crying after I told him because he was so excited because he knew my mom would be so happy. And so I had it all set up. I tape recorded the conversation with Leona when I talked to her on the phone. So I had it set up with the tape recorder. And so my mom gets home, and I asked her, I said, what's the one thing you've always wanted in your whole, that you've really wanted? And we lived on a farm, and my mom stopped and she thought for a little while, and she goes, well, I've always wanted that old red barn painted outside. And I said, no, not something your whole life that you've wanted. And she goes, oh, well, like I said, I'm going to hire a lawyer and see if I can't find my birth mother. And it says, I don't expect her to be living, but I'd like to know who she was. And I said, well, what would you say if you didn't have to do that? She's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, what would you say if I told you I talked to her last night on the phone? So she was crying, and I put the tape on so she could listen to the whole conversation. And she just couldn't believe this. And so finally I said to her, I said, well, you need to pull yourself together because she's expecting us to give her a call in about 30 minutes. And so we called her that night and talked to her right that night. So that was pretty funny. I just couldn't believe that she was telling me she was going to quit work because she was going to try to look full time to see if she couldn't find her. She had joined every organization you could imagine, all the adoptees groups in Kansas City. She had sent letters off to the Oprah clubs. I found all these letters things that she had joined, the register, and she never had any luck. Of course, Leona had promised she would never look for my mother. And so she never did. She just never assumed that she would ever have a chance to see her, because that was one of the things at the Willows. They said, you need to just move on. And that was what she did. So another real quick story, if we have time. When we went to see Grandma Leona, one of the things that she told us was that it was always so hard for her. She hated Valentine's Day. It was her least favorite holiday, which you can imagine, having had my mom on Valentine's Day and then have to give her up. So every Valentine's Day was a remembrance. And they told us that they really found it interesting because there was a nephew that was born on Valentine's Day, and Grandma Leona started making him a birthday cake on Valentine's Day. He was the only nephew and niece that she made a cake for. And she said, well, it wasn't fair because his birthday was on a holiday. And so I asked her, and she says, well, actually, I was making the cake for my baby Marcie every year as well. And so she said, it wasn't just for my nephew, but she also we went around that day and we went to a garage sale. And this lady had a bunch of dolls that was in a garage sale. And she looked at my mom and she said, I always worried that you didn't have a doll growing up. And she said, and my mom said, oh my, I always had a doll. They took really good care of me, had a wonderful life. And she said, I'm so glad to know that. But she said, could I buy a doll for you? And Leona bought a doll for my mom.
Oh.
My mom kept that doll on her bed the rest of her life. Every night or morning, she'd put that doll back on her bed. So that was kind of special.
Oh,
that's beautiful.
Hearing that, that's beautiful. Well, thank you again, KelLee. We appreciate.
Oh, you bet. Look forward to joining you in the future.
Yes, please do. We're here every Friday night, almost every Friday night, unless it's a holiday or something comes up at 7 p.m. And you're welcome to join us on future happy hours.
Right. Thank you. Well, I loved sharing the story, and I've really loved getting to know all of the people that I've gotten to know. So thank you for adding me to your family.
No, well, you're welcome. We're glad to have you.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got some closing announcements, and give us just 1 second here. Okay. Upcoming adoptee paths to recovery with David Bull. I think David had to hop off, but his upcoming support group is this Tuesday at 8, Jennifer, correct me, 8:30 p.m., right?
That is correct, and he posted the link in the chat just a couple of moments ago.
This is for all adoptees and their families. They're welcome to join us. And then
this is on the 12th.
We have Dr. Joyce joining us again, putting yourself together after reunion. I know there are many of you that come to this support group as well. That's on the 12th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send your questions ahead of time. You can email myself or Jen, and we hope to see many of you back again on the 12th with Dr. Joyce. And then, of course, our next guest on the 15th will be Astrid Castro from Adoption Mosaic. I know many of you here follow her as well, so we're really excited about chatting with her and learning all about her work in the adoption community. And that's all I have. Jen, do you have any other?
I'm going to drop the link into all of our events, so if anybody is interested, these are all registration on Eventbrite events that meet on Zoom, and these are all free events that are coming up.
Great. Okay, well, that's a wrap for me, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We love coming into your living rooms on Friday night. And if you have any guests, suggestions that you'd like to make for happy hour, again, you can reach out to myself or Jennifer, and we'd be happy to chat with you. If not, we'll plan on seeing you next Friday night at 7.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night. Have a good weekend.